Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast and the second episode of The Recap. Today we look back at our episode with Darren Hodge about cognitive overload and how to overcome it, as well as actively seeking feedback in order to increase and grow our resilience in the job. Hope you enjoy this episode. Make sure you go back and listen to the full episode for a lot more in-depth conversation about this. I was going to say that's a very nice segue into what I read in your book, is basically how much you have to go through cognitively and physically as well in that role when you're getting winched out and things don't go right. For example, losing your radios and things like that, and then having patients who are incredibly critical and having to take on board, okay, what do I do next? Like, that's a lot of cognitive overload. How do you cope with that?
I think managing cognitive burden, look, I'm fascinated by human factors and I do a lot of talking around that. And a lot of the lessons I learnt from the aviation industry, and managing cognitive burden and cognitive overload is really quite a defined art. And I think the people that I admire in my profession are the people who can manage that cognitive burden well. And I think it's probably, if we could come back and visit in a whole session, there is some things that you can do as students to learn to become better about managing cognitive burden. Because the reality is that whatever you bring to a scene, and often in my role, I'm the clinical leader, and if you bring an air of calm, that's infectious. But conversely, if you bring panic or, you're frantic or you don't have a system, that is also contagious. And I think one of the things that's perhaps not talked about overly in what we do as paramedics is coming in and bringing an air of calm and introducing a system. Cognitive burden and cognitive overload, I think, very few people would actually ever experience cognitive overload in their life. They might once or twice, but having those moments where you simply feel so overwhelmed, you just simply don't know what to do, is relatively rare. But as people in the health industry, that's something that we can experience. And there are some tools, some steps that we put in place to manage that. But essentially, the day that you start in your paramedic college, the system, the structure, the clinical approach, that's what gets you out of trouble when things get really hard. And, we're involved in, obviously, the pointy end of going to some of the worst accidents and injuries, but perhaps the hardest work that we do on the ambulance helicopter is retrieving someone out of a small rural hospital. And when you have people that have multi-system failures and are critically unwell, there's no great magic panacea or magic bullet. The DRABC mnemonic is what we go to, and that clinical approach and structure is what you would use when you feel overwhelmed. I mean, the thing about understanding cognitive overload is we all need to understand what happens to us individually when we have cognitive overload, because we all react a little bit differently. And some people become panicked, some people can yell and things. I become a quiet talker. And some of the common presentations when people have cognitive overload is they become silent. And, some of you guys, when you've done your placements, might have been at big jobs when you're looking for leadership, you're looking to someone to give you direction. When things are going badly and the senior clinician is just fixed on a task or just stops communicating. And that's because he's having cognitive overload. In the book, I talk about a story of a GP physician who works down in my part of Victoria, and a lovely man. And he was hit by a car and he was incredibly critically injured. But when I arrived, I just walked in right as he was on the cusp of dying. And I was halfway through my systematic approach, and he arrested. And the arrest it wasn't expected. He was combative and fighting. He was in hypovolemic shock, but he also had a traumatic brain injury. And we gave him a procedural dose of ketamine to allow us to oxygenate him. And he went from, having a very fast heart rate into cardiac arrest. And that happened at a moment when I didn't expect that the introduction of the ketamine, and he went into cardiac arrest. And I had that moment of feeling absolutely overwhelmed. And so at that point, you can go into a panic, and because there are so many complicated and many, many tasks to be done, you've got a great big workforce. But I simply stopped, and I had that period of time. I don't know how long it was, but I simply felt overwhelmed, and I acknowledged that I was overwhelmed. So I just went back to DRABC and that systematic approach of primary survey, secondary survey. And then when you have that cognitive overload where you're so overwhelmed, you can't be analytical. So that left and right side of the brain, you lose that ability to be analytical, but you don't need to be analytical. You go back and follow your system, which is learnt behaviour, which is you guys have been learning since day one. And you follow that DRABC and all the priorities will fall out of that. And then what we do and how we build the case from that point of view is we look at our team and we want to exploit the skills of the people within the team. So we want our intensive care paramedics working within their skill set extension. We don't want them doing ALS tasks. If we've got a big ALS team, we want the ALS people doing the ALS tasks. We want the intensive care people doing the intensive care tasks. When you have those moments of feeling so overwhelmed, if you fall back to structure, you'll never get it wrong. But it's what sometimes when paramedics do get it wrong is that they have things start spiraling out of control. They see a task, they go and attack it, they lose their situational awareness, they suffer from task focus, and then the patient has some degree of demise and they don't recognise it because they have lost that situational awareness, and it can end in disaster. So what I would say for the young paramedics now is I think that you need to listen to the feedback. The people that do exceptionally well in any profession are people who actively seek feedback. So when you do your placements and you're working with people, ask them their opinion. And if we're in a room full of people and we said, who wants feedback? We'd all put our hand up. Yeah, we all want feedback. The reality is we all want positive feedback. Now, where does the learning opportunities come in terms of feedback? The best learning opportunities comes from the constructive, or, if you do any teaching about feedback, you're not allowed to say negative feedback because it's a no word. But the critical feedback and the negative feedback is where the learning comes from. It's also looking at your failures. When I debrief people, I struggle when you say to people, so we arrived and the patient didn't have a drip in. Oh, yeah, I was about to do that. Okay, so we need to probably put that, I was about to do that. And the people become defensive with feedback, even if you don't agree with it. And I seek feedback from a lot of people, and sometimes I don't agree with their feedback, but I listen to it and I take it away and I analyse it. Sometimes I dismiss it. I go, I don't agree with it. But what I'm challenging the students to do is to listen to the feedback. And if you're not sure about it or you don't agree with it, cross-check it. And one of the greatest wake-up calls for me as a young intensive care paramedic was that I spoke to someone about a job that we'd done together. And I said, what feedback have you got? And he said, we did this well. I said, I'm not interested in the positives. I think that's good for building confidence, but I want to learn. So what constructive feedback? And he said, you can be a bit aggressive. I went, that's ridiculous. I've never been aggressive in my life. And then I spoke to one of my mentors. I said, this guy said I could be aggressive. And he laughed. And I said, what are you laughing? He goes, you are aggressive. I went, no, I'm not. And then it dawned on me, yes, I was. So in terms of, becoming better, you need to take the feedback on and learn from it. And also I think for the student groups, we must acknowledge and we must embrace this culture of self-reflection. Where am I at? Where are my strengths? Where are my weaknesses? One of the things that I've done, and I've been doing this for 34 years, is we keep a flight book. Every flight we do, we record where we've been, what we've gone, what the patient was. So what I always do is that I go and write down the learning points from that. So my self-critique of that case. And I used to only do the negatives, but sometimes being overcritical of yourself can be damaging. So I also now acknowledge what I did well in the case. So if you open my flight book up now, there'd be all these post-it notes of, more system review, whatever. I opened it up a few months ago and it said, don't be a dickhead. I'm not sure what happened that day, but something must have been pretty bad from my point of view. But so self-reflection and seek feedback and embrace your failures. So we have a history in ambulance that the expectation of the public, the patient, our employers is that we get everything right all the time. And that's just simply not possible. So that when we make mistakes, we don't want to hide them, we want to embrace them and we want to learn from them. Because if you fail and you don't learn from it, that's simply a failure. The best lessons in life come from your failures.
if there's one take-home point that you could give to the student paramedics listening, what would that piece of advice be?
I think the piece of advice would be to, it's okay to make a mistake. The expectation on you has never been greater. We have never had more paramedics in the system than we do now. So your ability to get exposure to work is reduced. And, you know, that it's hard. How do we expect people, we give them this guideline book, which is now so big no one can remember it. But if you've never seen someone in, I don't know, severe asthma, you know, how do we expect them to get it right all the time, every time? I think it's okay to make a mistake, as long as you learn from it. As long as you learn from it. And that's the key.
So team, that is the end of the second episode of the recap. Darren brought up some incredibly important concepts about cognitive overload, but the way to manage that is, one, understanding how you cope and how you react in that certain situation, and then two, overcoming that by utilizing the systematic approach, which is what we get taught from day dot. And then the second part of that was about actively seeking feedback. Not just the positive feedback, but being open to and willing to take on board all constructive feedback. So we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you enjoyed it, please go and listen to Season 1, Episode 2, where you'll hear the full episode with Darren Hodge. Hopefully this just gives you a little bit of insight and will help you this week, whether that may be at uni, on placement, or on road.